Okay, we now move on into the panel discussion. What we've seen and heard illustrated today so far has been the incredible breadth, the multifaceted, multidisciplinary nature of urban ventilation, and I'm delighted to welcome our panel, who we hope represent this breadth of key issues associated with urban ventilation. So first of all, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Hal Davis, who's the Technical Director of CIBSE. We have Irene Galau, who's Joint Head of the Specialist Modelling Group and a partner at Foster & Partners, and I understand she is joined by Andy Akered this afternoon. We're pleased to welcome Professor Elizabeth Shove, who's the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Lancaster University. Dr. Lena Siric, who is Senior Lecturer of Molecular Biology at UCL, whom I've been working with for the last 12 months, but not yet met, so I'm looking forward to seeing you. And fifth, but certainly not least, Professor Helen Ap-Simon, who's Professor of Air Pollution Studies at Imperial College London. And I understand that you are all here in the room with us. So what I'd like to do, first of all, before we open for questions, is just to ask each of you to very briefly introduce yourselves and your interest in and connections with urban ventilation. And whilst you're doing that, I will invite delegates to begin posting questions in the chat, which I will monitor, and then once we've gone through the introductions, I'll start to work my way through the questions. So if I could go first of all to Hal Davis and just ask you very briefly, Hal, to introduce yourself. Thank
you. Good afternoon, Malcolm. Thank you very much. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I worked at what was then the government's national lab, the building research establishment, when it was it belonged to the Department of the Environment, which shows how long ago it was. I left BRE soon after privatisation, and I've worked for about the last 20-something years with CIBSE. Of late, I've spent a lot of time working on some of the challenges around ventilation as a result of the pandemic. And I also spend a certain amount of my time working on the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. So all the things that you don't like about regulation, I anticipate will be coming my way in the next 45 minutes, but that's okay. I'm sure I can cope with that, and I've got a number of reasons why it isn't my fault when we get to them. I hope that's some help, Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Hal. I'm sure you can cope with those questions. On to Irene Galau. Irene, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'm heading the Specialist Modelling Group within Foster & Partners, as you said. The Specialist Modelling Group is an in-house consultancy group, really, and we're focusing on two areas. One is on building physics, and then the other one is design to production and fabrication. My background is architecture, but I have specialized in building physics. Started my career in Buro Happold as an environmental engineer and very quickly moved to Foster's. And I'm with Foster's for the last 15 years now, working in the same group, same area, still there.
Thank you, Irene. And I understand Andy Akered is with you as well today, is that right? And
yes.
He's a member of your group.
Yes, Andy?
Yes, hi everyone. I work with Irene in the Specialist Modelling Group at Foster & Partners. I'm joining today because I'm our in-house specialist on natural and hybrid ventilation. I joined Foster & Partners in 2016 after spending 5 years in academia, principally looking at the fluid dynamics of natural ventilation. And I'm also part of the CIBSE Natural Ventilation Group Committee, who's producing a new version of the AM10 Natural Ventilation Guidance document. And since joining F&P, I've also expanded, not just looking at natural and hybrid ventilation, but also looking at acoustics. acoustics and ventilation, obviously quite conflicting demands in building design. And also a topic that's come up a lot already today, smart buildings, sensors, Internet of Things, and the apps that go with that, and crucially user engagement. How do we ensure that people use the buildings in the healthiest and most efficient way?
Thanks very much, Andy. It's good to have you with us. Moving on to Elizabeth Shove. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yep. So I haven't got much of an interest in ventilation. I'll be honest about that from the start. I'm a sociologist and I work at Lancaster University. I've written quite a lot about the history of comfort and, in a way, the history of the indoor climate as well. And although I'm not a historian, I'm especially interested in this context, in where we are at the moment in the kind of trajectory of ideas about air, health, well-being and buildings. So we have to remember that all the kind of measuring and monitoring and everything that you're talking about here is actually really very strange. And it carries a lot of assumptions with it, including ideas about air as a phenomena in its own right, or as a vector or whatever. So I'm interested in the theory of air, if you see what I mean. And I also think the relation with comfort is key. So is ventilation part of comfort? Is it getting in the way of comfort? Is it something to be managed? And these are not questions that you're going to resolve by modelling or engineering equations or anything. These are questions of kind of theory and philosophy. And so I guess those are the sorts of things I'm interested in. The value of a draft. Should air conditioning mimic the kind of breeze from the sea? Or what happened? How did we get to the position of this standardized fixed bubble of indoor climate without much breeze or movement? And so I've written lots about the history of that, and I won't go into that now. But I think unless, in a way, there's a broader discussion about where you are collectively, where these debates are, then in a way you're just fiddling around in the margins. So that's an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's really helpful. I mean, is ventilation getting in the way of comfort is such a useful question to pose, and it's come up time and time again today. Thermal versus comfort versus energy. What is the? How do we reconcile these important building physics issues? Thank you, Elizabeth. On to Lena. Can I ask you to introduce yourself, Lena, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. I am Lena. I am a molecular microbiologist. I've worked through my career on lots of different environments, from diesel eating groundwater microbes to the human mouth, but then in the end settled on the indoor environment and looking to see what microbes are living with us in indoor spaces, and where they are and how to kill them, but maybe not all of them, how to kill the baddies. So yeah, my interest really is in, at the moment, very much centered on COVID and looking at how indoor spaces and air might contribute to transmission, but in the long term, we'll have other pathogens that we might be concerned about. And I hope that COVID will ultimately result in better indoor air in all indoor spaces. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Lena. I might come back to you in a minute. There's a question in the chat there that I think I'm going to put in your direction. And finally, but certainly not least, Professor Helen Knapp-Simon, please could you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me too. Looking back, I first became interested in indoor air pollution after the Chernobyl accident. And we were very concerned about how radiation penetrated into buildings. And this is when BRE, that we've been hearing about, did a lot of work, and a lot of other organisations. And I remember at Imperial, we were playing with fluorescent particles of different sizes and looking how they deposited on different surfaces and on skin, etc. And I also remember when we were thinking about what might happen if we got another pandemic like the Spanish flu, the work that was being done by Porton Down, for example, putting viruses on cobwebs in the sunshine to see how the sunshine destroyed them. And I've just been thinking how much things have moved on since then, how we've recognised the indoor air pollution sources. and how the science has really developed too, what we can do with CFD modelling now. As a member of the steering committee of the Clean Air Programme, I was delighted when we decided that we would fund work on indoor air pollution and the exchange with outdoor air. I think that was a really good decision. And of course, that was then emphasised by COVID. I'm an air pollution modeller, and I think I have realised that as compared with the simple ideas I have on wind and turbulence dispersing pollution outdoors, the indoor environment is just so much more complicated. And I'd like to say I'm very impressed by some of the work I see already going on. For example, CFD modelling of the thermal effects and how the heat of a body and your breath, I mean, that's probably rising to the ceiling now. And on the other hand, I'm horrified by things that we could put right so easily. Office buildings taking in new air from outside at the start of the day from polluted rush hour traffic, so that they've got air that they can build up the carbon dioxide levels in as people occupy the buildings during the day. That sort of thing just shouldn't happen, and it's so easy to put right, and it makes me so angry. And looking at problems of dealing with COVID in a local hospital that I deal with, and I see the problems of trying to segregate COVID areas from non-COVID areas in that hospital. And it makes me realise how we just haven't thought about these problems in the spread of infection. So those are my range of interests, and I'm delighted to see this network and this interaction of the wide range of people that need to be involved.
Thank you very much. That's a really helpful introduction, and again, prompting lots of thoughts. Very helpful, thank you. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming into the chat, and I've got a few that were sent to me prior to today. So we've got plenty to go at in the next half an hour. But as I forewarned Lena, the first question I'm going to pose to you, and that is from Matt Butler at Fresh Air NHS. Medics appear to be behind the curve when it comes to indoor air quality and spread of airborne diseases. Given the lead medics take in public health messaging, how can we break down misconceptions and misunderstandings given these topics are not included in classical medical education? If I go to Lena first and then perhaps on to Helen.
Sure, yeah, I will try to address the why, but the how is so much more difficult. So I think the why medics are behind the curve is that it simply isn't something that they learn much about, or that is a big priority in their day-to-day practice. So I think that's the issue. And I think also for decades, you know, the environment was not really thought to play a part in the transmission of infectious disease. So it was all thought to be about contact rather than anything that might be in water, anything that might be spreading via surfaces, and then air as well, of course. And I think to some extent in the context of the pandemic, the medical community was not keen to admit to airborne transmission, because that meant that things were much worse and are going to be much more difficult to manage than they initially thought. And then how do we get past this? Well, I mean, to some extent, I think COVID is, you know, one of the positive things that might come out of COVID is that the systems that are in place will have to be reviewed, and people will have to become a lot better informed about them. So, I mean, I've worked with a number of different hospitals over the last 10 years, and I have to say the majority of them aren't that clued up as to the various infection control, the various measures in their infection control arsenal that they can employ. And I think that the average clinician on the ward doesn't necessarily know what a negative pressure room or a positive pressure room is, nor, you know, what to do if there's a failure within these and so on. So I hope that one good thing that comes out of the pandemic is that there will generally be a better understanding of what we can do, and an acknowledgement that you know, the environment does play a role and that we need to address it.
Thank you very much, Lena. Can I just bring in Howell at this point, because the second part of Matt's question talks about what measures can hospitals take who are facing frequent outbreaks of COVID, and Lena there refers to some of the technical terms, negative pressures, etc., etc. And of course, I'm aware that CIBSE has published guidance on ventilation during the pandemic. Hal, would you just like to offer one or two thoughts on what hospitals might consider doing during the COVID pandemic?
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. I mean, I do think that if I could quickly just respond to the previous remarks, it does seem to me that we're quite good at forgetting history and all the work that was done not in the last century but in the 19th century by Florence Nightingale. She worked out the impact of ventilation on improving health outcomes and one or two other things besides. I understand that even in the Spanish flu pandemic, an awful lot of patients were taken outside during the day to get, I'll use the term outside air to avoid anybody responding on fresh air in the chat. And they also got exposure to sunshine, which some of what I've read suggests were good things to do. And perhaps if I've not read the right things, somebody will come back on that. Moving to the question of hospitals, I think we do have a challenge, and I'm going to duck slightly here, Malcolm, because as you well know, the CIBSE guidance wasn't aimed at hospitals. It was almost aimed at anything but hospitals. And there was a reason for that, which Matt's question kind of points to. And the reason for that is that the NHS has its own in-house people who deal with their buildings and ventilation. They have their own HTM03, and it can be difficult for those outside the NHS to have much influence on the system. Now, I don't think it's the medics who are responsible for that, although if there were some medics who really understood the values of good ventilation, perhaps they'd be pressing their estates managers a little bit more. But I think at this stage, perhaps the estate managers just need to be prepared to look a bit more carefully. Are they getting appropriate ventilation? Are the internal flows going where they think they are? Or are they actually not going the right way and possibly doing some harm? And what is their scope to do something about it in the middle of a pandemic when everybody in the system is under huge stress and pressure? And it may be very difficult to make practical changes to hospitals right now. I think the lesson from this is that when we do reach a point where things have calmed down a little and everybody's got a little bit more time to think and reflect, we need to be prepared to both ask questions and give honest answers. And possibly we're accepting that if people own up to things not having been done brilliantly, let's not shoot the messengers, let's sort out the systems and make sure that in future they are done brilliantly. So that's not a lot of practical help to Matt if he wants to fix a ventilation system today, but I hope it's a little bit more of a reflective view of how we can learn from this at some point in the near future.
Hal, thank you very much indeed. Please can I encourage everyone to keep the questions coming, and while those continue to come in, I have a question here that I'd like to pose to Irene and or Andy, and that is, how do we best deal with poor ventilation and indoor air quality in existing buildings? What are the biggest priorities or the quickest wins? We often when we're considering energy and improving indoor environmental quality, we talk about, so what are we going to do with the existing stock, which comprises such a high proportion of what we've got? What are the biggest priorities with our existing stock, and perhaps what might be the quickest wins? Irene or Andy, do you want to have a go at that one?
Shall I jump in on this one,
Yes.
Irene?
Yep.
Yeah, I think yeah, something that I've already mentioned a couple of times today in the chats is, I think one of the things that we can do is make use of the growing Internet of Things market, because there are so many consumer products out there. There are more and more products out there that are affordable environmental quality sensors that can do CO2, VOCs, and we're trying to sort of practice what we preach at our office campus in Battersea by installing multi-parameter environmental sensors and connecting them with a specialist BMS and IoT integration consultant, who will then look at the data that you're getting from these devices and finding the low-hanging fruit in terms of what's going wrong with your existing plant. It could be something as simple as you need to change a valve somewhere, but it's, you know, these are aging systems, they may not have properly been instrumented. If you can retrofit them with appropriate sensing, you can then do sort of a cost benefit analysis of what needs maintaining and when. And on top of that, obviously, you can be monitoring the indoor environment itself and reacting to that dynamically, using machine learning, for example, with data from sensors. You know, you can anticipate, for example, if you've got a breakout space that is always used every day, and then the BMS can anticipate that. So being proactive rather than reactive. And what goes, I think also what goes with being able to censor our buildings properly is being able to have smart and interactive apps that will encourage user engagement. A big barrier sort of in my field of natural ventilation is controlling it properly, and that is often down to user engagement, encouraging people to open and close windows at the right times. Now that should be intuitive, but you need to encourage user engagement, and I think the more data we have, the more power we have, and if we need to present it in the right way, obviously, but I think that smart buildings and the apps that go with them could become very useful tools in terms of air quality as well as efficiency.
Thank you very much, Andy. A point made by Tim here in the chat about wholeheartedly agree with Hal, but it's the challenge. But the challenge is that the construction industry is set up to avoid liability. That's just reminded me of a question I'd like to pose to Irene. And that is, it's well known that many buildings do not perform to the standards they should meet. What do you think are the reasons for this performance gap, and how can we address them? Thank you, Irene. That's really helpful, and it brings me nicely on to a question for Elizabeth, actually. So in the chat, we've got a reminder about CO2 sensors and traffic light systems here, and Kate Deselincourt says, in schools, kids are great at calling out when the monitor flags up high CO2. There's a massive potential here for participatory research. So Elizabeth, there's a tendency to think of buildings as a technical problem, but there's clearly a very strong social side to enabling better environments. And I'm just wondering, how can we best capitalize on the current interests that COVID has sparked in terms of enabling better indoor environments? How can we best capitalize on that and ensure we most effectively move forwards towards a new, more holistic approach to urban and indoor design? Elizabeth.
Well, that's a hell of a question. There's a lot packed in there.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so there's two things. I'll pick on two things. One is, I think it's tempting, and we've just seen that, to separate the technology on the one hand, or the buildings, from the user. If you, again, you only need a tiny little bit of history to understand that the expectation of the indoor climate generally, and as shared, is a consequence of buildings and of conditions that people experience. So there is no perfect optimum condition. There are no users. I think the whole language of users is extremely troublesome, because it supposes people have wishes aside from the environments that they inhabit. So to think about if only the users did this or that, it falls into the trap of separating technology on the one hand and social science on the other. Good social science is about the technology and the interface and the kind of recursive production of what counts as normal. So that brings me to the second issue, which is the kind of irony of optimizing. So you're talking about indoor air quality as if we know what it is, and as if that's a known thing, how to do this, how to make users do that, and the rest of it. If we only have to scratch the surface, or even in this panel, it's quite clear there are really different views about what that might be. And it's also clear, Lena mentioned many people packed into a small space. That changes what is possible and what is not possible. So there's something really important, and with COVID, about kind of getting away from an illusion of a perfect environment. That's never going to be the case. It's about working with the variety that's out there to do different sorts of things in different situations. And that's, again, I think, where some of the framing of the problem, it's not users versus thing, it's about what's going on here in general as a combined effort.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this point about what is indoor air quality, what does it mean, it is an important one. You know, we can't see CO2, we can't smell it, and actually we don't know how stale a space is and whether that's a problem for us until we go out and we come back in and it smells a bit stuffy. So I think there's a lot that can be done here in terms of figuring out what language we use to get people on board and excited about indoor air quality, why it's important, and what the easy wins are.
Usually it wouldn't be a case of exciting. People talk about this with energy, if only they realised how much they were using and so on. This is not really how it goes. And I think being excited about indoor air quality is the least likely relevant way forward. What matters is these kind of much broader conventions of like breeze or indoor and outdoor, and understandings of what it is to be indoors in different situations. That's not about excitement, that's about getting on with everyday life.
Okay.
Can I just jump in with a point here?
Please do, Andy.
Yeah, Elizabeth, completely agree with you on that. It needs to be a holistic approach. And you know, what I've seen with working with natural ventilation, we talk a lot about adaptive thermal comfort, which is the idea that, you know, if you've got more connection with your environment and you're more connected with the outdoors, you will be happier in a wider range of environmental conditions, which makes sense. You know, if you go outside, you dress appropriately and you expect certain conditions because you can see what the weather's doing. But we seem to have, I mean, I think we're trying to get away from this in general in the industry, of this deterministic approach of the sealed box. Because there are studies out there that show if you do exist in that sealed box environment, in the perfect environment, for a while, then your brain starts shutting down because you get bored. There's not enough stimulus. It's better to have an environment that is dynamic and varying. But of course, that makes it quite a complex field.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, just following on from what Elizabeth's just been saying, a question here from Nick Wise. What incentives are there for businesses, for example, shops, restaurants, to make sure their IAQ is better than just good enough to avoid complaints? This is a public health issue. Could there not be a scheme like with food hygiene ratings, where the air quality of a premises is checked and the results shared? Irene, Andy, or Howell, anybody want to come in on that one? What incentives are there for businesses to make sure their IAQ is better than just good enough?
Quick solutions are really needed right now.
Yeah, thank you. And Irene, when people come to you and ask you, what should we do about our restaurant? What should we do about our office space? Is your response, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is your response a technological one in terms of the building services provision, or is it a behavioral one, or is it a combination of things? Thank you very much, Irene. Thank you. Hal, there's been a number of questions and comments about air change rates, and you may have seen the question there from Paul. Is there a magic number for fresh air rate? Does 10 litres per second per person in CIBSE correspond to maintaining CO2 levels? And then Dave W after that saying, is CO2 an appropriate metric? You know, we've had these conversations a number of times, haven't we, Hal, about is it the provision of the fresh air, or is it how the fresh air is distributed, or actually is it what the what the incoming air is doing to key parameters within the space? Would you like to have a go at that lot?
I'll have a go, Malcolm. Yes. I mean, I don't think there is a magic number, but I think there is a widespread view that in many cases 10 litres per second per person is likely to be the appropriate number, and that one of the key questions is, are we actually getting it? You know, are the systems properly maintained, and are they actually delivering that? I fear in some cases there might even be a question of, were they ever able to deliver that? Were they ever correctly designed? And I fear that one of the things that COVID has exposed is another angle on the performance gap in buildings. I think many on the call will have come across the performance gap in terms of the difference between designed energy performance and real energy performance. Perhaps we have a similar gap between designed ventilation performance and what's actually achieved. And it's how we build it rather than the design figures that's the challenge there. The whole CO2 thing has caused an awful lot of debate, some of it amongst many people on this call. If you've got high levels of CO2, I think we're all reasonably confident that we know we've got a problem. Where we're not so confident is if you've got low levels of CO2, are you sure that that it's okay? And the concern is that the smaller a space gets, the less you can rely on lower CO2 levels. And this is where the air changes per hour comes in. And you really want to be sure you're getting the 10 litres per second. And I responded, I think it was Matt earlier, put something in about air changes per hour. Perhaps the actual flow rate rather than air changes per hour is the number to work on. So I think our view, and again, there's been some email discussion since the new variant was discovered. Did that mean we needed to up the ventilation rates? No. I think the view is that we jolly well need to make sure we're getting 10 litres per second per person effectively in all cases, and really watch the smaller rooms where it's more likely that you're going to get stagnant spots or that you haven't really got enough ventilation going in. There may be a few cases where you do need more than 10 litres, but they are going to be the exceptions. Yeah. And above all, people need to make sure the systems work. And I think I can almost sense Elizabeth picking up, it's the combination of technology and people again. You can have good systems, but if the people don't know how to run them, then your good system won't work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hal. I'd actually like to bring in Helen at this point. We're talking about ventilation rates, we're talking about air change rates, and Darren Wolf has mentioned in the chat about air change rates in the breathing zone, which starts to talk about ventilation effectiveness. So I'd like to just ask you, Helen, about I'd like to take us back to the pollutants that we're trying to control here, and ask you, what do you think are the pollutants of greatest concern, and which ones the network ought to be focusing on in terms of adequate and healthy ventilation? You're muted at the moment, Helen.
Yes. I think this was one of the discussion questions for one of the breakout sessions, wasn't it? And obviously, I think you've got the, some of the key ones, PM 2.5, NO2, the VOs. I think we need to think a little bit more about what your indoor sources are. I mean, we know what the pollutants are outdoors and what is going to get inside. We know how those might be amplified, for example, by cooking or whatever. I think the VOCs, and I think this is almost a question that goes back to Zani this morning. There are some specific species that are probably particularly noxious. We have also had other concerns like photocopiers and ozone. But I think if you start off with the PM 2.5 and the NO2 and some of the VOCs, that would be a good start. And just coming back to some of the other questions that have been going through, the first question was the concern about medics not really being aware.
Yep.
And I think, they've got to understand these basic pollutants. I'm wondering how the case of Ella is actually going to impact on the medical profession if there is going to be increasing awareness.
Yeah.
But I'm very aware that we need to do much more to inform the public too. If I work in the hospital in emergency department, there will be leaflets on all sorts of things. How to stop falling over in the ice and goodness knows what. But there's absolutely nothing on air quality. Same if you go into a GP surgery. And I think there's so much more we could do to raise awareness and understanding, and to make sure that people understand what these pollutants are and where they come from, indoors as well as out.
Indoors as well as outdoors, yeah. And I think that brings us in quite nicely into the into the nexus of this network, and that is it's linking the two together. It's understanding the impact of one on the other. So thank you very much, Helen. We are out of time. There's a few questions still in the chat. One in particular for you, Elizabeth, from Bryony Turner. If I could ask you to have a look at that one perhaps later on. So with that, it's now 3:45. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for very fully answering the questions and giving us lots and lots to think about. Thank you all very much for your time and for your input this afternoon. Very much appreciated. With that, I will hand back to Kath Noakes, who's going to wrap up the sessions today. Kath.
Thanks, Malcolm. Hopefully you can see my screen again there. Thank you to all of the panelists. I'd just like to echo, I think we could have gone on for far longer than we did there, because there's an awful lot of questions in this area, and I hope we'll be able to come back to many of them. I mean, I think I would like to also say thank you to everybody who has talked today and who has participated in today. It's a hugely complex area, this. There's not a single easy answer, and I think we've really, I guess, explored those complexities today. I guess our next step in this is to try and figure out how we articulate those complexities together and how we identify which aspects of this we are able to tackle. We, as a network, we cannot answer everything, or even do the research on everything. So we will have to figure out which bits we're going to focus on and why. Just to finish up today, a few brief comments. So the next steps that we go from here are about how we take all this forward. So we've shared some of the themes and the ideas with you, and we've got a huge amount of feedback back and a huge amount of discussion already. And we now need to shape those core areas. What are we going to focus those on, and what are going to be the priorities in here? I think the whole idea about how we work out what those interactions of key variables are, so it is, as I think Paul said this morning, systems of systems. We need to think about how those systems link together and link the physical environment, the human behavioural environment, the health consequences together, and the elements that different people can control or not, as the case may be, and where these sit in the regulatory frameworks, because that's the only way we can influence change ultimately. On a more practical note, we are thinking about how we adapt the programme for COVID. We obviously wrote this grant before the pandemic. The pandemic is, I hate to say the word opportunity, but it is an opportunity for this area. It's never been more timely, and we need to work out how we adapt what we do, both in the priorities of the order in which we do things. There are some things where if we bring things forward, we might be able to put out even just simple public information that can actually make a difference now, but also thinking through the longer term and how we can use it as a lever to make change about the resilience of our environment across the piece in this. And on a more practical note, how we adapt to deal with delivering a network programme in an environment where networking is quite a challenge. And we are now thinking about the schedules of workshops and the events programme that will come from this. The other next steps that will come from this will be this first setup of pilot research activities. These will initially be led by the investigator team, but I hope I know we will bring a number of you into some of those even now. And we'll be thinking about how we can set up initial test sites for things, set up initial models, put together initial data sets, systematic review work, and as Tim mentioned earlier, the community science activities, which I think are probably one of the highest priorities at the moment, and particularly around how people ventilate their buildings and the understanding of the knowledge across different groups of people about what to do in their building. As a sort of early things that we know are going to come next, we are planning to set up a seminar programme. This will run on probably a monthly basis. It might be a bit more frequent than that, we'll see. Just as a way of connecting in openly to people who are interested in this whole space, and also to connect in internationally with people. I think one of the joys of online activities is that seminars are considerably easier to set up and run and get a great audience and get great speakers than they ever were before. It's much easier for people to do without having to take days out of their time to travel. So that's coming fairly soon, and we hope to have the early theme workshops probably in early spring for each theme to really nail some of the challenges in there. Some of the theme leads highlighted they were interested in people contacting them. Of course, if you've got an interest in any of the themes, you can contact us through the Breathing City mailing email, and Helen will put you in touch with the right people. We are looking at how we can identify the gaps in there and develop these research ideas from it, and we will be sharing a lot of these through the mailing list. So if we hope that many of you will have agreed to be on the mailing list from signing up today, and if you know people who would like to join, let them know. I think we can do that through our website to get people on our mailing list. We're not going to abuse the mailing list. It's very much for this network rather than for anything else. And we've mentioned already CCORM funding. We expect this call to be launched in early spring. Just to give you a word of warning, it's not big money. It'll be, probably £2,000 or £3,000, just small money to start things off. But it is, we're not a wealthy network, but it's the starting point to just get people collaborating together and do some initial little bits of work to take things forward. The other thing that we are quite keen to do is to figure out better ways to network. and we'd really welcome any ideas in this respect. I know it's very hard to facilitate networking. Online, it's great for presentation. It's a lot less effective for those social interactions and the conversations that we'd have normally had over coffee and over lunch, that often are the things which spark an idea and lead people to go and set up a project and start working together. So if people do have ideas, we'd really like to hear them, how we can enable people to have those sort of more flexible conversations through the network. I'd also just like to flag that the network is not alone in this space. As Stephen mentioned in the very first talk, we are one of 6 networks under the Clean Air programme. The other networks are listed there, and the Clean Air programme, the information on those networks is on their webpage. TAPAS particularly is, I guess, a close network to us because we share several people in common across the two, and I think there's some similarities in thinking about what's going on in a particular environment, and obviously schools is a particular environment. So I'm expecting that we will have interaction with all of those networks, but in the particular that one. And I've just realised I made a typo and then I've written one of the networks twice. The last network should be a different one, which is on bioaerosols, which I clearly have got wrong when I wrote that slide. There's also the STFC Air Quality Network, which I know many of you have been involved in before. And then this group came off the back of the HEMAC network, the Urban Fluid Mechanics and the Low Energy Ventilation, SIGs. So they do still exist. I suspect a lot of their activities will, particularly Urban Fluid Mechanics and Low Energy Ventilation, will become subsumed into this. But they do still exist. And if any of you are not aware of the UK Indoor Environments Group, that is another group that interact very well in this space and interact across between policy and practice and research. But obviously, if there are other networks and things that we should be flagging, and particularly on our webpage, please let us know. I am conscious as well that a lot of these are often driven from a more of the science of air quality perspective, rather than the interfaces with behaviour and practice. And I think bringing that more on board, I think, is something that's really important for us. So I just want to say again, thank you. I also want to say thank you to Helen Freeman, who's our network coordinator and has worked incredibly hard behind the scenes in putting this together today. Putting any event like this together is hard work, but when it's the first one and you've not run one before in this way, it's doubly hard, because I think it's, you know, it involves a lot of will it work, won't it? Will it work, won't it work thoughts. So thank you, Helen, for all the hard work there, and thank you to the people, my team of people within the network who've also worked very hard in putting together things for today. So please stay in touch with us, please contact us. If you're not on our mailing list, let us know. We will be in touch following this with some of the slides, some of the outcomes from today. We hope to post some of the talks on the web. And I really hope that we will be able to keep engaging with you over the next 3 years to really use this network to make a difference. It's such a timely space at the moment that I think it's very important that we get this right and we use this to our best advantage to really try and shake this field up a bit and move things forward. So thank you ever so much, and we've even finished on time. Look at that. So I'll say goodbye to you all. Thank you.